This chapter is laid out into 4 parts. So each part moves chronologically through the history of philosophy and how it relates to walking. So we'll begin with the classical period and then go to Rousseau, and then Kierkegaard, and finally the Post-modernists. So part 1 is called Pedestrian Architecture. Solnit begins by saying, the history of walking goes back further than the history of human beings, but the history of walking as a conscious cultural act rather than a means to an end is only a few centuries old in Europe. The English writer John Thelwall wrote a massive book called The Peripatetic, uniting Rousseauian Romanticism with the classical tradition. After this book, it became an established idea that the ancients walked to think, and led the common notion that links thinking and walking. This belief arose from a coincidence of architecture and language. When Aristotle set up a school in Athens, the city gave him a plot of land. In it, a covered colonnade, a row of columns supporting a roof, was where the pupils gathered and the teachers gave their lectures. This is where Aristotle himself was said to have lectured. This place was called the Peripatos. The philosophers who came from it were called peripatetic philosophers, or the peripatetic school. And in English, the word peripatetic means one who walks habitually and extensively. Thus, the names are linked. Peripatetic meaning someone who walks, and the peripatetic school of philosophers. In ancient Greece, another group of philosophers at the time, the sophists, were often mobile, as many of those whose first loyalty is to ideas. Ideas are not a reliable or popular crop as, say, corn, and those who cultivate them often must keep moving in pursuit of support as well as truth. Many professions and many cultures, from musicians to medics, have been nomadic and have possessed a sort of diplomatic immunity to the strife between communities that keeps others local. This brings us to part 2 of the chapter about Rousseau, called Consecrating Walking. Rousseau laid the groundwork for the ideological edifice within which walking itself would be enshrined. Not the walking that took Wittgenstein back and forth in Russell's room, but the walking that took Nietzsche out into the landscape. In 1789, the writer and encyclopedist Denis Diderot was thrown into jail for writing an essay questioning the goodness of God. Rousseau, a close friend of Diderot's at the time, took to visiting him in jail, walking the 6 miles from his home in Paris to the dungeon. Though that summer was extremely hot, says Rousseau in his not entirely reliable Confessions, he walked because he was too poor to travel by any other means. He wrote, "One day I took the Mercure de France and came upon this question propounded by the Dijon Academy for the next year's prize. Has the progress of the sciences and arts done more to corrupt morals or improve them? The moment I read that, I beheld another universe and became another man. In this other universe, this other man won the prize, and the published essay became famous for its furious condemnation of such progress." Rousseau's bold articulation of the tension between the emerging sensibilities of his time, the assertion that God, monarchical government, and nature were all aligned, was becoming untenable. Now the assumption that the natural good and the simple are all aligned seems commonplace. Then it was incendiary. In Christian theology, nature and humanity had both fallen from grace after Eden. It was Christian civilization that redeemed them, so that goodness was cultural rather than a natural state. Rousseau reverses this claim. He insists that men and nature are better in their original condition. This is an attack on cities, aristocrats, technology, sophistication, and even theology. In his discourse on inequality, Rousseau portrays a man in his natural world, wandering in the forests without industry, without speech, without domicile, without war, and without liaisons, with no need of his fellow men, likewise with no desire to harm them. This treatise offhandedly ignores Christian narratives of human origins and reaches towards a prescient comparative anthropology of social evolution instead. Though it reiterates Christianity's theme from the fall of grace, it reverses the direction of this fall. It's no longer into nature, but into culture. Rousseau portrays himself as a pedestrian and claimed kin to his ideal walker before history. Rousseau's walker is not a part of society, but not entirely freed from it either. They are alienated, they are solitude. The walker is self-sufficient and not tied down like the worker. The walker survives in the world he feels has betrayed him. If Rousseau was a radical, his most profoundly radical act was to revalue the personal and the private, for which walking, solitude, and wilderness provided favorable conditions. If he inspired revolutions, they were for him only necessary to overthrow the impediments to such experience. Part 3. Walking and Thinking and Walking. Kierkegaard is the subject of this shorter passage, but we begin with Kierkegaard, who he actually chose cities, or one in particular, Copenhagen, as his place to walk. He compared his urban tours to rural botanizing. Human beings were the specimens he gathered. Kierkegaard lived an intensely private life and lived off inheritance. For most with full private lives, the city streets were the most casual of social spaces. But for Kierkegaard, it was really his only social role, and therefore his most vital. He reveled in the turbulent variety of city life. This moment, there's an organ grinder down the street playing and singing. It is wonderful. It is the accidental and insignificant things in life which are significant, he wrote. Rousseau and Kierkegaard's walking is only accessible to us because they wrote about it in more personal, descriptive works, Rousseau's Confessions and Reveries, and Kierkegaard's journals. Walking is itself a way of grounding one's thoughts in a personal and embodied experience of the world. That's why it lends itself to more personal styles of writing, such as essays, journals, poetry, letter. 2. These eccentrics focus on walking as a means of modulating their alienation, and this kind of alienation was a new phenomenon in intellectual history. They were neither immersed in the society around them nor removed from it. The solitary walker is unsettled between places, drawn forth into action by desire and lack, having the detachment of the traveler rather than the ties of the worker, dweller, or member of a group. So part 4, we talk about the postmodernists called the missing subject. So postmodernists writing on walking, or rather distinctive lack of writing on walking. Postmodernists see the body rather not as an active force, but a site for sensations. It does not suffer under the elements of encounter other species experience, such as primal fear or exhilaration or muscular strain. The body is a passive object. Having been liberated from manual labor, our body lives in the sensory deprivation chambers of air-conditioned offices and apartments. This body has nothing left except to age and maybe feel the erotic residue of what it means to be embodied. Postmodernists deal with abstraction and flux, and are therefore unburdened by the responsibilities of specific description. This explains why postmodernists may have so little to say about walking. Only in some writings does the body become active again, such as in Elaine Scarry's book, The Body in Pain, The Unmaking and Making of the World. She considers first how torture destroys the conscious world of its subject, then theorizes how creative efforts, making both stories and objects, construct the world. She describes tools and manufactured objects as extensions of the body and thus ways of knowing it. Tools become more and more detached from the body itself until the digging stick that extends from the arm becomes a backhoe that replaces the body. She never discusses walking directly, although her work does suggest philosophical approaches to the subject, such as walking returns the body to its original limits again. Walking extends into the world, as do the tools that augment the body. The path is an extension of walking. The places set aside for walking are monuments to that pursuit. And walking is a mode of making the world as well as being in it. Thus, the walking body can be traced in the places it has made. Paths, parks, and sidewalks are traces of the acting out of imagination and desire. Walking sticks, shoes, maps, canteens, and backpacks are further material results of that desire. Walking shares with making and working that crucial element of engagement of the body and the mind with the world, of knowing the world through the body and the body through the world.